Well, hello and welcome back. We're still together breaking open the Word. More interestingly, we're still wrestling with John, recording Jesus and a whole lot of sayings about the bread of life, one of his great I am sayings. Welcome, David, coming back to us from the theology program at the University of Otago. Steve, from the depths of Southland and Invercargill, and Trish from Mosgiel, just to show that we've got a good spread of the southern regions here. Good to have you on board. And David, can you give us some little background to this quite challenging text in John?
Sure, it's an absolutely fascinating text and it's really dense and there's a lot going on. Just a couple of thematic contexts and then a little bit of geographical context. So in verse 35, where Jesus says, "I'm the bread of life, whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me never be thirsty." There seems to be a reference there going back to John chapter 4, when Jesus was in Samaria, and the woman at the well, the discussion of living water, not being thirsty again. Earlier in chapter 6, he's already had the feeding of the multitude and the discussion of bread from heaven, and he's indicated that he's come down from heaven. So verse 35 is bringing this all together in a really dense way. And then the 41 to 51 part picks up on the bread and the hunger. And there seems to be a very clear reference here to Exodus 16, the manna in the wilderness, the bread from heaven. And some commentators have suggested that actually this part of chapter 6, 41 to 51, resembles quite an established approach in Jewish homiletics, where a scriptural verse is set out, as in John 6:31, "As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." And then the rest of the passage is an elaboration of this. So Jesus is elaborating on a particular verse. So that's the couple of things about the thematic context. Then in terms of geographical context, it's worth being aware of all the movement that's going on here. So in John 4, Jesus was journeying through Samaria, which is where he encountered the woman at the well. In John 5, he was at Jerusalem doing the miracle at the pool. In John 6, he's up in Galilee, and he's actually crossed Galilee at one point and moving around the Galilean area. So that there's lots going on. The chapter itself opens with this move back to Galilee, initially on the eastern side, then back to the northwestern shore, which is where we're located now.
Okay, thank you. And, you know, I like to talk about challenge. In some ways, John is such a dense recorder of these Jesus sayings and events that we have to work just to unpack some of that. But thanks for that opening. And I want to talk about challenge. So I'm going to ask Steve, when you read this passage, what challenges you, either in the passage or in applying the passage and Jesus' sayings?
That's a good question. There's so much in that. There's the murmuring of the Jews, which sounds remarkably like people we know today. And I read something today about hunger and how when a person is really hungry, it can change their personality. So there's a theme there to work with as well.
So we've got those classic things, of course, of that double reading. We've got both the literal hunger, and that's an interesting point about personality change, and this kind of spiritual hunger. And John works, when he tells the Jesus story, on these two levels, more than one level, often. So yeah, thanks, Steve. Trish, unpacking some challenge. You find some challenge?
Absolutely. Just about everywhere I looked, I found challenge. And the thing about the passage is that it is on multiple layers. The thing that particularly struck me was the notion of their moaning, the moaning and grumbling about, well, for heaven's sake, we know who Jesus is. You know, isn't he the son of Joseph and Mary? And we know his street address. We know who his parents are. How can he possibly say he's come down from heaven? So it was this, and that sounded remarkably like the moaning and groaning of the people in Mark. And I was thinking, they have an image of who Jesus is, and think they know who he is. So it doesn't allow, it's a limited image, and it doesn't allow of his a bigger picture of who he is. But Jesus pushes back and says, and talks about and claims his divine as well as his human understanding, and talks about his heavenly Father. So the challenge for me is he's clear about who he is, but the crowd aren't. And so he's talking about the challenge of, is it literal or metaphorical? How can he come down from heaven? And I think the tension here is not only what you just said about the literal and the metaphorical, but the everyday and the mystical. And how do we create a language where we can make sense of what Jesus is talking about? How do we make experiential sense of that?
And David, you've given us some background, but what about a personal challenge when you wrestle with this text?
So in terms of positive challenge, there's the not hungering. It is, I think, and it's been clear for some time that world hunger could be a thing of the past. If we're talking about the social political application of this text, that it's been recognized that the policy, the technology is possible. It's the political will which has been missing for decades. The thing which has changed in the last couple of years is we've seen that with political will, amazing things can be done. So COVID has challenged the global community to respond, and it did respond. Now, if you had that response to global hunger, you would have a dramatic change in terms of people not being hungry again. So that's a positive challenge. In terms of a negative challenge, unfortunately, John constantly presents opposition to Jesus in terms of this generic character, the Jews. And that's a troubling aspect of this passage. That's a challenging aspect to understand that, not in terms of actual people, the Jews, but John's understanding of opposition to Jesus.
And in terms of our history, that's a very delicate issue. And I thank you for that. That's a really important, in fact, the use of the words, the Jews, that's a lovely way of unpacking it, David, and I appreciate that.
Can I just want to add a point? I was going to say that the very familiarity with Jesus of the Jews or of the crowd actually gets in the way of them seeing him. So they think they know who he is, but that image gets in the way of them seeing who he really is.
So that familiarity breeds contempt.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Sorry.
Yes, thanks, Trish. So when confronted, and there's a whole lot of stuff, there's the very realistic feeding that David, you've just spoken about. This hints, obviously, that can't be ignored about something Eucharistic going on here. So, Steve, if you encounter this passage, good news for you, good news as you go out and about in the world.
It says, no one comes, but the Father draws them. It says that to be saved, you just have to believe. And the two are connected. And it also says that for understanding, we will be taught by God. So that's great for a person who is discovering God, discovering faith. That is really encouraging news, that you just need to believe, that if you have come to God and believe, it's because you've been called by God. That's right. And that God will teach you.
So the initiative very much on God, and of course the Reformation kind of recaptured that in a big way 500 years ago. The initiative from God, and often we turn the good news into bad news, but there is invitation there. There is good news. There is, we're presuming, and we're hearing in the text, the God who reaches out to us. David, how does that represent good news for you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to pick up on that and to perhaps make it a bit more pointed, it's an ethic of radical love that I think we see in this passage, and an ethic of radical love expressed in tangible and bodily ways. So it's not an abstract, just entirely spiritualized love, but it's identifying how God's love can be expressed in the meeting of bodily needs. That there's possibly some eschatological reference here, as well as the Eucharistic one. It's certainly there, I think. But what it shows is Jesus actively engaged with really pressing questions and expressing good news in very physical and very earthly ways.
So you're not wanting us to get away with merely spiritualizing. We really want to have our feet on the ground.
Yeah, I think it's really drawing it together. It's a holistic salvation which is being spoken of here.
We want some good news here, and what's hit you?
I think, well, just building a little bit on what David said, I'm fascinated by this tension of the everyday bread and the everyday drink, which meets our bodily needs, but meets our spiritual. So in the mystery, there's also the everyday, and the opposite of that is true. And in the everyday, there is the mystery. But the thing that really struck me is that Jesus is enough. Jesus is all we need. Jesus is the gift of life. I am everything you need. Come to me, and you will not die or be hungry ever. So Jesus is enough. Jesus will meet our needs. It requires our will and our choice and our thinking and our leaning into the trust, but Jesus is enough. And sometimes I don't see that. Yeah, absolutely.
And if I always find if John's brave enough to put this in his recording of these Jesus sayings, then it's got to resonate with the experiences of the people that he's writing for.
Mm.
And again, we're in this world of turmoil and tumult, and I guess it always has been, but we need to know how this affects us. It's all very well having pie in the sky, but so what for us? So what for the hungry people? David?
I think it is bringing home the message that Jesus is offering a holistic message. It's not just abstract principles. These are the pressing matters of the day, perhaps less pressing for most people in New Zealand, but I was at an event at Musselburgh Baptist Church last night when we were discussing food insecurity and nutritional insecurity, and some very moving stories told, even about people in New Zealand going to bed hungry. And certainly this is showing that it's no abstract philosophy that Jesus is speaking to. He's responding to people's immediate and daily needs in the spiritual teaching that he's offering.
So again, no pie in the sky, but a real applied principles. Steve, do you hear that as well?
Indeed. Trish said resonates with me. What David said resonates with me. And food security and food insecurity and climate change. The technology and the knowledge exists to reverse all of that. It just requires the will to do it.
And of course, when we're on the edge of the Pacific, and if we don't respond to their need, we're not exactly holding the tension, the spiritual and the practical intention. Trish?
Well, I think that the two things that struck me were about how do I get stuck in my image and understanding of who Jesus is, and how am I limited by that, and do I see Jesus? And linked to that, do I see the gift of who Jesus is? And am I therefore able to see and receive the gift? And am I open to receiving the gift? And is the gift of Jesus what I want as well? So there's an interactive, quite provoking, thought-provoking, not negatively provoking challenge about who is this Jesus? Who might I not be seeing? What gift might I and everybody else I know not be receiving?
So to wrap up, David, I'd like to throw back to you with that thought. If we talk about a Jesus who is purely ethereal and purely spiritual, and we act on that principle, it sounds to me as though we're not hearing the guts, if I can put it, of this passage.
No, and not only are we not hearing this passage, but we've also lost track of John 1:14, that the word was made flesh. And in John's gospel, these come together in a really strong incarnated way. It's absolutely clear throughout the gospel.
Yeah. And can I add one bit to that, Steve? I read a phrase that had the notion of uncomfortable incarnation. And I thought that really struck me, that little phrase. Jesus is uncomfortably, or God is uncomfortably incarnational, and we can't avoid that.
All right. Let's sit with that passage and that uncomfortable incarnation. Trish, Steve, David, yet again, thank you very much.